Let's dig a little deeper into the EU-ASEAN summit. We're joined by Antonio Fatas. He's a professor of economics at INSEAD Business School. Professor, talks have barely begun at this summit. We're already hearing earlier from our correspondent the joint communique, which she says will be very important. Already disagreements there on the political status of Taiwan, and also the EU unable to convince all ASEAN states to take a firm verbal line on Russia. Does this surprise you?
No, I don't think it's a surprise. I think we're talking about issues which are really complex. I think there's an issue of sort of dealing with Taiwan, which I think is a very complex one for the Asian community. And it's clear that it's very difficult to imagine words that would sort of suit everyone. It's very hard to find a compromise there. So my sense is that one will be avoided. When it comes to Russia, I think obviously Europe would like to have the harshest possible words one could have on a communique. But as we saw in the G20, not all countries are on board. Of course, countries are okay with a sort of loose statements of condemnation and probably with similar words as in the G20, which is most countries sort of are condemning the Russia invasion, but no one is willing to go, not everyone is willing to go and sort of impose sanctions the way the Europeans are. So I think the compromise is a wording which is critical of Russia, but it doesn't go far enough relative to what the Europeans probably would love.
Well, this kind of compromise, so we're likely to see a joint communique, a declaration that essentially gives a nod to ASEAN centrality, gives a nod to abiding by international rules-based order, but without any firm action on any one side. Is that sufficient to bring this relationship forward?
I think it is at this stage. I think the reality is all the countries in this summit, what they want is they want peace. They want a world which is more stable. They want to deepen their economic relations. That's really what they want. Now, but the reality is that there is a war in Europe. And that war in Europe, of course, everyone would love for that war not to be there. But the type of actions that Europeans would like to take or are taken already are probably very different from what other countries want to take, in particular in Asia. So I think you're finding a compromise because there is such a difficult situation where in some sense everyone agrees that peace would be the ideal scenario for the world and following the rules, political rules, economic rules, but that's not the reality. The reality is that we have a conflict in Europe and we have potentially other conflicts around the world, and everyone is trying to navigate about around the reality of those conflicts while stating principles that I think everyone agrees. I think there is a very strong consensus on those principles.
All right, you talk about other conflicts. So here in Asia, or specifically the South China Sea. Now, ASEAN, if we look at the State of ASEAN 2022, they specifically spelled out who they would look to hedge against uncertainties due to US-China rivalry. And the number one was at 40.2% was the European Union. So that's what we have on paper. That's what ASEAN wants from the European Union as a hedge against EU-China strategic rivalry. Well, the EU wants perhaps more support when it comes to Russia. Do you see their need for each other being symmetrical, asymmetrical? Who does it favor?
I think it's very symmetric. I think you have the tensions between China and the US, which are very specific to those superpowers. They're not going to go away. They're probably increasing as time passes. And then you have Europe, you have ASEAN, which are regions which in some sense, they would love those tensions to go away. And what they're trying to find is they're trying to find these sort of counterpoints, counterweights to the big two superpowers. And they're trying to look for a world which maybe is more multipolar. So there's no such an obsession with sort of always the tensions between those two countries. And I see this as very symmetric. I think Europe needs Asia and Asia needs Europe. And I think this is a relationship that likely is going to grow, and certainly both parties want it to grow. Again, with the reality, which is there is a war in Europe already, there is the potential for additional conflicts. And when these issues happen, I think you're going to have to see a compromise. You're not going to see always uniformity in the messages, even if there is a lot of consensus on the principles.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're speaking with Antonio Fatas, Professor of Economics at INSEAD.